Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. In our previous lecture, we finished up the introductory material by looking at some of the more important 20th century theories of what myth is and how it works. In this lecture, we are going to turn to discussing classical myth itself by beginning by looking at the creation story as recounted in the book known as the Theogony by the poet Hesiod. This is the most complete surviving Greek account of the creation of the universe. Hesiod probably lived and composed his Theogony sometime in the early 7th century BC. Throughout the 20th century, it was always assumed he was a bit earlier than that, perhaps the end of the 8th century, but the tendency among scholars nowadays is to put him slightly later. We don't know his exact dates, but most scholars nowadays would say he wrote just after the Iliad and the Odyssey were written down, which was sometime at the very end of the 8th century, beginning of the 7th century. So he was just slightly later than that. His poetry is very similar to the Iliad and the Odyssey in many respects. For instance, he uses the same dactylic hexameter meter that the Iliad and the Odyssey both use. A good deal of the vocabulary is the same. Certainly the epic diction and dialect is very much the same. However, there are some differences in terms of the poetics. The poems of Hesiod are on a smaller scale compared to the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are very, very long poems. His poetry is also long, but not as long as they are. And there are some differences also in terms of the poetic voice that is used. Hesiod presents himself as kind of speaking from the first person and even tells us something about himself on different occasions within his poetry, which is altogether different from the invisible quality of the narrator of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The point that they really share in common, however, is in the fact that they were both sets of poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey on the one hand, and Hesiod's poetry on the other, particularly the Theogony, are both sets of poems that are derived from a very long oral tradition that had existed for centuries prior to these poems being written down. The mythology of the Greeks went through many centuries of development in an oral setting, in a pre-literate setting that we've talked about before. And because of this, Hesiod did not make up any of the material that he is writing about. He did, of course, organize it. He shaped it. He decided which particular details to include in the Theogony and which ones to leave out. So he certainly had a very strong poetic influence and artistic influence on the material. However, he is ultimately transmitting it. He is not creating this by himself. These tales of gods and men are already many, many centuries old by the time that Hesiod is writing them down. And so the Theogony, because it is the first of any such kind of poem that we have in terms of an actual description of the creation of the world, is as close as we can get to the actual orally transmitted myths about creation that were told in Greece in the centuries prior to the reinvention of literacy. There were other theogonies, that is, other accounts of the creation of the universe and of the gods in ancient Greece, but those texts have not survived. Hesiod's version of the way that the world came into being is the most complete creation account in Greek that we have, therefore. However, it is important to realize that this was never an orthodoxy. Hesiod's work is not something that any person in the ancient Greek world had to believe in order to be a member of the Greek religion, or the pagan religion, the worship of Zeus and the other gods. Greek religion did not work that way. There was no sacred text in the sense that Christianity has the Bible. The Theogony, therefore, is not analogous to Genesis, although we will be kind of examining some of the differences between the ideas that are present inside of the Theogony and those that are found inside of the book of Genesis and in other parts of the Bible later on in this lecture. But the key point to mention is that it is not a set body of doctrine. Hesiod's version of the traditional myths about how the world came into being, widely accepted though they were in antiquity, and very influential though they were on Greek culture, were not in any sense an orthodoxy that had to be believed. Okay, so that is a very important point to make at the outset. Now, the word theogony literally means the genesis of the gods, okay, theogonia, the origin or coming into existence of the gods. The material that Hesiod presents in Theogony, however, even though this is the title of the whole work, is as much a description of how the whole universe in a physical sense came into existence as it is a description of how the gods came into existence. And the reason for this is that in Hesiod's worldview, as we're going to see, the worldview reflected in the Theogony, the gods are not separate from the universe. They are part and parcel of the material world. We will keep coming back to this point throughout this lecture. And just to remark on that at the outset, this is a very good example of the kind of multivalent explanatory nature of myth, how myth can explain many different things at one and the same time through one and the same narrative. Since in Hesiod's worldview, the gods comprise the universe, the gods are not separate from the universe, but are elements within it. When he tells how they came into existence, he is simultaneously also telling us how the world came into existence. And this means that a character, as we will see, can be and usually is at one and the same time both a natural force or element, the sun, the moon, the stars, the sea, and that kind of thing, and an anthropomorphic entity at the same time with volition, emotion, bodily functions. This was something that we discussed a little bit in the first lecture, if you recall, when I mentioned Gaia and Uranos, whom we will also be learning much more about in this lecture. The creation story, therefore, that Hesiod presents in the Theogony actually tells us a great deal about how the Greeks viewed the gods, though that is not what he set out to do. Hesiod set out simply to describe how they came into being, because in his culture, their nature was already understood. They were the gods. People already knew what kind of gods they were. But for us, looking at these stories from the outside, Hesiod gives us a great deal of information about the type of gods that he and his culture worshipped, telling us these things kind of almost inadvertently, because they weren't his main focus in the text, but he does tell us those things kind of, along the way. Now, as I've already said, these gods did not create the universe. They are simply part of it. Now, this implies, among other things, that these gods are not omnipotent within the universe, though they are envisioned by Hesiod and, of course, Homer and the other great poets of antiquity as being extremely powerful. None of them, not even Zeus, the head god, is altogether omnipotent. None of them are all-powerful. They are not outside of the universe. They are not transcendent of the universe. Okay, this creates the further implication that in Hesiod's account of creation, there is no external creator. And in fact, I've been using the word creation this whole time, but in many ways, that's a slightly misleading word here, because there is no creator. As Hesiod tells the story, the universe simply comes into being. There's no explanation. There's no prime mover that sets the whole process in motion. The universe simply comes into being, and the gods with them, with the universe, come into being. They simply come into existence without any creator setting the process in motion. These gods, in other words, as I said, are not transcendent. They are not outside, beyond, or separate from the material universe. They simply come into existence as it does. What makes the gods different than human beings, then? Well, the main dividing line in all of Greek mythology is that the gods are immortal. They are hoi athanatoi. They do not die. This, of course, has several important implications implications for points that Hesiod covers in the Theogony. Because a god cannot die, he cannot be killed. So long as the universe lasts, these gods are immortal. Now, of course, because they come into existence with the universe, I suppose the logic is that if the universe ever ended, the gods would go with it. And so they're not immortal in the absolute sense. But as long as the universe is there, they are immortal. Furthermore, as we will see in our discussion today of the Theogony, these gods are highly anthropomorphic. They eat, drink, sleep, mate, give birth, have emotions, feel anger, all of that sort of thing. Now, the Theogony begins with by positing several primordial deities. Chaos is the first one, Gaia, Tartaros, and Eros. Now, chaos, this is an interesting word. We use this word in English. And as I've told you before in other lectures, I have 6 little children, so I know about chaos. But that is actually not what the meaning of the word chaos is here. It does not mean disorder. Chaos in ancient Greek means a gap, a yawning open space. It is etymologically related to our English word chasm. Okay, so chaos is emptiness, it's nothingness. At first, there was nothing. That's basically what Hesiod begins with. But nothing is envisioned as an entity in and of itself, paradoxically. And then from this chaos, that is, from this primordial nothingness, after that, he says, came Gaia. Now, he does not make it clear whether the other original entities were born from chaos or whether they simply appeared after chaos. He just says first was chaos, and after it came Gaia. Let us read the opening lines. Verily at the first chaos came to be, but next wide-bosomed earth, Gaia, the ever-sure foundations of all the deathless ones, who hold the peaks of snowy Olympus, and dim Tartarus in the depth of the wide-paved earth, and Eros, fairest among the deathless gods, who unnerves the limbs and overcomes the mind and wise counsels of all gods and all men within them. From chaos came forth Erebus and black night, but of night were born Ether and Day, whom she conceived and bare from union in love with Erebus. So Gaia, or sometimes also she is called simply Ge, G-E, where we get the word geometry from, geocentric. Gaia comes right after chaos in Hesiod's kind of genealogies. And of course, this makes sense, right? Hesiod's worldview was geocentric. The world was considered to be the center of the universe. And so it makes sense in that way that the first deity to come into existence after chaos would be the earth itself. Tartaros is also mentioned here as one of the 4 primordial deities. Tartarus is the underworld, the land that will eventually house the spirits of the dead. But of course, there aren't any yet, so when it's empty for the moment, but in time, there will be spirits of the dead that will occupy Tartarus. What about Eros? Eros obviously means, it is usually translated as love. Better translation would be desire. The god Eros is the personification of desire, and this may surprise you that Eros is one of Hesiod's primordial deities, because in more commonly known versions of Greek myth, Eros is the son of Aphrodite. In the Latin, that would be Venus, and his name in Latin would be Cupid. Okay, he is usually depicted as that naked baby going around shooting arrows at people. But in the more standard versions of the story, he is Aphrodite's son. In Hesiod's version, however, Eros is a primordial deity. He is right there from the very beginning, before Aphrodite. And this is a good illustration of what I've touched upon before about the different versions of myth being used according to what purpose a particular teller of a myth has in mind. Hesiod is going to describe for us how the universe came into existence, and in his account of the created world, again, I use the word created kind of imprecisely here, in his account of how the world comes into being, almost all the development within the universe will take place through the medium of reproduction. This is how he's going to describe how everything comes into existence. And if he is going to do that, if he's going to describe how everything comes into being through the medium of reproduction, then desire has to be there right from the very beginning. Eros, therefore, must be a primordial deity in Hesiod's account, or else none of the development of the rest of the world would happen. It does not seem to have been a problem for Hesiod's audience, or even later generations of Greeks reading his work, that Eros to Hesiod is a primordial deity, and to other authors, he is the son of Aphrodite. That does not seem to have been a problem whatsoever. And again, we have to keep that idea in mind, that this whole idea of that there's one set idea of a myth is just totally erroneous. What seems to us to be a contradiction, therefore, seems not to have troubled the Greeks at all. After the appearance of these primordial deities, Chaos, Gaia, Tartaros, and Eros, birth and reproduction become the standard means of development in the world. These first deities simply come into existence, but after that, deities come into existence through birth. Birth is usually, though not always, preceded by conception. Not always, however. Chaos, as we saw here, gives birth to night, and Erebos simply on chaos's own. Okay. Night, we all can understand what it is. That's self-explanatory. What about Erebos? Erebos is the gloomy darkness within Tartarus. It may seem a bit odd to us that Tartarus and Erebos should be separate entities, as if you could have Tartarus and not the gloomy darkness within Tartarus. But according to Hesiod, there they are. Okay, two separate things. Night and Erebos, we then are told, mate and produce ether, that is the bright upper air, and Hemera, that is day. Gaia, on her own, without mating with anyone, gives birth to Uranos, the sky, Pontos, the sea, and the mountains. In other words, the earth is now beginning to take on the recognizable shape that would have been familiar to the people of Hesiod's day. Pontos here simply means the sea, and in particular the Mediterranean Sea, the sea in the middle of the known world, to be distinguished from another sea that we're going to learn about in a little while, Okeanos. Gaia first exists, it seems, as a flat disk. The earth is perceived as being disc-shaped, and then she shapes herself into the more familiar earth of the Greeks, as I said, by making the Mediterranean Sea Pontos in the center of the land and producing the mountain ranges that would have been familiar to Hesiod and his audience. Once Gaia has produced Uranos, then she mates with him, and they beget 12 children. These 12 children are the first generation of gods to be born after Gaia, and they are called the Titans. The Titans include important natural elements or natural entities such as the sun, the moon, and the river Okeanos, which is a river which flows around the edges of Gaia. To complete our picture of Hesiod's worldview here, imagine the disc-shaped earth that you see in front of you, but with a never-ending river flowing around the edges of this disc-shaped earth. In the Greek world, obviously, it was centered around the Mediterranean. If you were kind of reckless enough to sail out of the Mediterranean through the Rock of Gibraltar, that is that pinch point between North Africa and Spain at the very western edge of the Mediterranean Sea, which the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules. If you did that, you would leave Pontos behind, the known sea, and then you would go into this stream of Okeanos, of ocean, where you would sail around forever without ever reaching land, because ocean flows continually around the edges of Gaia. And this is what Hesiod says: "And earth first bare starry heaven equal to herself, to cover her on every side, and to be an ever sure abiding place for the blessed gods. And she brought forth long hills, graceful haunts of the goddess nymphs, who dwell amongst the glens of the hills. She bare also the fruitless deep with his raging swell, Pontus, without sweet union of love. But afterwards she lay with heaven and bare deep swirling ocean, Okeanos, Koios, and Krios, and Hyperion, and Iapetus, Thea, and Rhea, Themos, and Mnemosyne, and gold-crowned Phoebe, and lovely Tethys." Okay, these are the 12 Titans. Okay, there's one that I'm leaving out, but I'm going to get to him in a moment. Gaia and Uranos therefore mate and produce these 12 children, but all is not well, because, as we read, after them was born Kronos, the wily, youngest and most terrible of her children, and he hated his lusty sire, that is, he hated Uranos. Why? Well, because we hear that Uranos does not allow these children to be born. He pushes each one of them back into Gaia as each child is born, that is, back into the earth. Uranos refuses to let his children be born, and this causes great pain to Gaia, as well as causing her great anger. And therefore, we hear from Hesiod that she conspires with her youngest son, that is, the Titan named Kronos, to overthrow Kronos's father Uranos. Gaia produces a sickle, somehow, and gives it to Kronos, and he hides within her body. And this is what we read. He, meaning Uranos, used to hide them, meaning all of those Titan children, away in a secret place of earth, Gaia, so soon as each was born, and would not suffer them to come up into the light. And Uranos, heaven, rejoiced in his evil doing. But vast earth, Gaia, groaned within, being straitened. And she made the element of grey flint, and shaped a great sickle, and told her plan to her dear sons. And she spoke, cheering them, while she was vexed in her dear heart. My children, gotten of a sinful father, if you will obey me, we should punish the vile outrage of your father, for he first thought of doing shameful things. So she said, but fear seized them all, and none of them uttered a word. But great Kronos, the wily, took courage, and answered his dear mother, Mother, I will undertake to do this deed, for I reverence not our father of evil name, for he first thought of doing shameful things. So he said, and vast earth rejoiced greatly in spirit, and set and hid him in an ambush, and put in his hands a jagged sickle, and revealed to him the whole plot. And heaven, Uranos, came, bringing on night and longing for love, and he lay about earth, spreading himself full upon her. Then the sun from his ambush stretched forth his left hand, and in his right hand took the great long sickle with jagged teeth, and swiftly lopped off his father's members, and cast them away to fall behind him. And not vainly did they fall from his hand, for all the bloody drops that gushed forth earth received. And as the seasons moved around, she bare the strong Irinwes. These are these kind of vicious, demonic, evil goddesses that inflict vengeance upon people who do certain moral wrongs. And the great giants with gleaming armor, holding long spears in their hands, and the nymphs, these are kind of minor water spirits, whom they call the Melii, all over the boundless earth. Okay, so Uranos is now kind of, wounded by his son Kronos, who was hiding there inside of Gaia in the earth. And Kronos then throws the severed members into the sea, and out of the foam that springs up from them is born none other than Aphrodite, as we read. And as soon as he had cut off the members with flint and cast them from the land into the surging sea, they were swept away over the main a long time. And a white foam spread around them from the immortal flesh, and in it there grew a maiden. First she drew near holy Cythera, and from there afterwards she came to sea-girt Cyprus, and came forth an awful and lovely goddess, and grass grew up about her beneath her shapely feet. Her gods and men call Aphrodite, and the foam-born goddess and rich-crowned Cytherea, because she grew amid the foam, and Cytherea because she reached Cythera, and Kyprogenes because she was born in billowy Cyprus, and Philomedes because she sprang from the members. And with her went Eros, and comely Desire followed her at her birth at the first, and as she went into the assembly of the gods. This honor she has from the beginning, and this is the portion allotted to her amongst men and undying gods, the whisperings of maidens and smiles and deceits, with sweet delight and love and graciousness. This, of course, is the famous birth of Venus that is depicted in Botticelli's famous Venus on a Half Shell. That's not the real title, but this is one of the most famous Renaissance paintings of all time, the birth of Venus. Okay, so this is and her name, we are told from Hesiod, means born from the foam, because the word aphro in Greek means foam. It still means that even to this day. When you go to a Greek cafe and order your frappe, you can order it metapoliaphro, with a lot of foam. But anyway, don't think about this story, though, when you're having that frappe. At this point, Uranos retreats from Gaia and becomes the dome of the sky. He never again takes any active part in anything that happens in Theogony. He cannot be killed, as I have already said. A god, by definition, cannot be killed. What Kronos has done, therefore, is the next best thing. He has disabled his father by wounding him. Obviously, if he cannot be killed, depriving him of his power to the greatest extent possible is a very clear symbolic way of depriving him of any kind of influence that he can then have thenceforward. So Uranos, as I say, becomes the dome of the sky that touches Gaia on all sides. He doesn't go away. He's always there. If one goes outside and looks up, that's Uranos. But he is no longer an active participant in the Theogony. This also leaves physical room for the children now to be born, those 12 Titans. And the picture that Hesiod is presenting here is that before the wounding of Uranos, Uranos was not yet the dome of the sky, it seems, with which we are all familiar. He was pressing down on Gaia flat. There was no separation between them, quite literally no room for the children to be born and develop. And it is only when Uranos retreats and becomes the sky that the Titan children can spring forth from Gaia and become powerful entities in their own right. Now, as I mentioned briefly in the first lecture, this story is an excellent example of the way myth can work on several levels at once, because Gaia is the earth and Uranos is the sky, but at the same time, Gaia is very anthropomorphic. She is female. She has a womb. She can feel pain and anger when her husband pushes her babies back inside of her. She can conspire with her youngest son. She can create a sickle for Kronos to use and overpowering his father. All of this is going on one level. While at the same time, we have the picture that I've put in front of you describing the sky pressing down on the earth and there be no room for anything to grow between them and so on. So you have both a physical picture of the sky and earth as they really are, and a story of this proto-war between the sexes, if you like, in which the female conspires with the younger male to overthrow the dominant male. Once Uranos has backed away, once he has retreated and become the dome of the sky, then there is room for Gaia's children to exist, as I said. Not only for them to exist, but to mate and reproduce in their own right. And this is represented in the text of Hesiod by a whole flurry of reproduction, at which point Hesiod kind of goes into about, in some editions, 3 or 4 pages of the text, in which he describes all the Titans mating off with one another, producing literally hundreds of offspring. He lays great emphasis on the water, streams, lakes, rivers, and so forth that come into existence at this time. So the physical earth is completed by the reproduction that comes along with the Titans after Uranos has let Gaia give birth to her children. The story of Kronos wounding his father lent itself remarkably easily from ancient times to an allegorical interpretation, due to a certain resemblance of Kronos's name to the Greek word for time. You see, the word Kronos, which is the name of the god in Greek, if you put a slightly different sound at the front of it, a kind of rougher form of the K sound, chronos, then you wind up with the Greek word for time, which you can still see in English words like chronology and chronological. Chronos with an H after it. See, that's why those words have a CH, because in Greek there's this letter chi, which has a kind of sound to it. So that's why that is kind of rendered in English with a CH, even though we don't pronounce it as a fricative. In ancient Greek, it would have sounded like that. So, but it's chronos, and that lent itself very easily to the Greek mind, apparently, for an allegorical interpretation, where the similarity of name for Kronos and the word for time seems to imply that when Kronos was freed from Gaia's womb, after he wounded his father Uranos, after, that is, there was this kind of separation between matter and space, you see, then time came into existence. Isn't that amazing? Because the created world, of course, exists in the 3 elements of the universe are time, space, and matter. And so here you have this kind of separation, violent separation, if you like, between matter, Gaia, and space, Uranos. And what happens what is the relationship between those 2 things? Time. You see, time only exists as a relational entity between space and matter. It's a fascinating and fairly sophisticated concept and interpretation. Not only is it necessary for there to be space for Gaia's children to develop in, not only does Uranos now back away and leave room for the children to develop, but time is also necessary. You've got time, space, and matter. Now, linguists tell us that these 2 words, chronos, the god, and chronos, time, are not actually etymologically related. One of the things that we'll see throughout our course, and the more you study of classical literature, you'll find out that the ancients simply delighted in false etymologies. And there's all sorts of brilliant ones, My favorite one is mentioned in the Roman Epicurean poet Lucretius, who's writing a poem on the nature of the universe, De Rerum Natura. And what he basically says on one occasion is that the potentialities for one change of substance into another are already there in potentia inside of the first one. So fire exists in potentia inside of wood. And the way you can see this is that even in the very words, the word for fire, ignis in Latin, mystically inheres inside of the word for wood, lignus, you see. Now, that is a brilliant etymology. It's totally false. And there's many others that one can give here too. But so this is maybe the first of those, these false etymologies between chronos and chronos. But nevertheless, even though they come from two entirely different roots, and they are in fact not different versions of the same name, I don't even actually think that that militates against the reasonableness of kind of interpreting this myth in such a way. I don't think it invalidates an allegorical interpretation. If Hesiod and his audience, maybe they didn't even have that idea. That probably the earliest attesting of this allegorical interpretation comes from the 6th century, so a good, over 100 years after Hesiod. But it definitely had a long history afterwards, and it makes a lot of sense. I like it. I like the way it kind of interpreted that way. And we're going to see that this would become a common thing in later times as well, to go back and look at these very strange, gory, outre kind of myths, and be able to scavenge them for a deeper meaning by an allegorical interpretation. That way of reading myth would have a very long history indeed, throughout the ancient world and into the modern world. Returning to our narrative, once the Titans are freed from Gaia's womb, they become the main actors in the story. As I say, they pair off and start mating with one another. The same basic pattern repeats itself in the next generation as Kronos, though, who in turn tries to prevent the birth, or at least the development, of his own children. Kronos marries his sister Rhea, and they produce together 6 children, 3 daughters and 3 sons. The daughters are Hestia, Demeter, and Hera, and the sons are Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. Now, you would think that Kronos would have learned from his father's sad fate the futility of trying to prevent his children from developing. He does learn enough from his father that he doesn't leave his children in Rhea's womb or try to push them back or hide them or something like that. Instead, he waits until the children are born and then swallows them. He swallows each child in turn as it is born. So instead of leaving them in Rhea's body, he takes control of them by placing them in his own body. Rhea, like her mother Gaia before her, is infuriated by this and therefore conspires to overthrow Kronos, to trick Kronos out of his evil plan. She substitutes for the youngest child, Zeus, a stone, a rock wrapped in swaddling clothes, which she gives to Kronos, and he swallows it, thinking it is his own baby. And you can see some ancient depictions of this in front of you. Now, obviously, there's 2 points to be making here. First of all, we see yet again something that the gods are clearly lacking, and that is omniscience. Okay, they are not all-knowing. They can be deceived, they can be tricked. So in addition to not being omnipotent, they are not omniscient either. Although we might, and whenever I teach this in class, invariably a student raises a hand and says, how stupid could this guy be? Forget about even being not omniscient. But really, a stone thinking it's a child? But I think at this point, we kind of have to sort of just temporary suspension of disbelief. We're not going after realism here. This sort of story is not, meant to be realistic in any sense. Even in our own kind of fairy tales, if you were to think of Little Red Riding Hood, I think there's a bit of stone eating there too, isn't there? Isn't that something that happens? But it certainly, wouldn't Little Red Riding Hood realize that the wolf is not her own grandmother, just dressed up? Obviously, again, it's not realism, so we shouldn't kind of apply those standards to it. But the point about the gods not being omniscient is definitely important to make. So Kronos swallows the stone, thinking that it is the baby Zeus. Zeus is sent to the island of Crete to be reared in secret. Hesiod does not tell us how long it takes Zeus to grow up and reach full maturity, but once he does, Zeus returns home and helps his siblings escape from their father. He also sets into motion the events that will lead to the overthrow of Kronos and Zeus's own ascension to power. Hesiod is unfortunately rather vague about the details of how Kronos is induced to spit out his children. But induced to spit them out he is, and since gods cannot die, Zeus's siblings have remained alive within Kronos's body. They are spat out in reverse order from the order in which they are born. In this sense, Zeus is therefore both the youngest of his siblings and the eldest of his siblings. He is the last born, but the first to reach maturity. The others are spat out in reverse order, so Hestia is the firstborn, and in some sense also the youngest, the last one to be spit out by their father Kronos. Now Zeus and his 5 siblings are together with Zeus's own children in the next generation, together called the Olympians, okay? The gods who live on Olympus. And just a little note about terminology here. When the Greeks talk about the gods, they very frequently use that word to mean Zeus and his 5 siblings and Zeus's children, who are all collectively called the Olympians. Yet, of course, as we can see from everything we've talked about so far today, all of these entities are gods. The Titans are gods, Gaia is a god or a goddess, Uranus is a god. So the use of the term gods to mean Zeus and his immediate family is a little bit confusing, yet it is very common. Then there is this 10-year war that ensues at this point between Kronos and his siblings and Zeus and his siblings on the other side. And that is frequently referred to as the war between the gods and the Titans, which would be much more appropriately referred to as the war between the Olympians and the Titans, because they're all gods. So just so you're aware of it, very frequently the term the gods refers to Zeus and his immediate family, despite the fact that all these entities are actually gods. Now, the two sides fight for 10 years, as I said. Eventually, Zeus is triumphant, and at this point, the struggle for power ends. The order of rule in the universe is set. Zeus will remain the head god forever, and there won't be any more of this intergenerational kind of eating and overthrowing of the previous patriarch. And that is why Zeus is oftentimes referred to simply as the Olympian. Okay, he is the primary Olympian among all the Olympians. One immediately noticeable and intriguing point about this narrative is that it portrays the struggle for power among the gods as one involving older female deities as opposed by and helped by younger male deities. Gaia is the oldest deity. Uranus works against her. She enlists the help of a still younger male, that is Kronos, to overthrow Uranus. Kronos, in turn, opposes Rhea, who enlists the help of a still younger male, Zeus, to overthrow Kronos. What is going on with all this? Well, there are many possible answers. Some scholars argue that this reflects the psychological anxieties of males about coming to maturity, having in some sense to replace their fathers as mature men acting in the world, but also worried that their sons will in turn replace them, and worried about the affection that their wives feel for those sons, kind of like father-son rivalry. Other scholars see the increased anthropomorphism of each generation. Gaia is the earth, Uranus is the sky, Kronos is sword of time. Rhea, however, is just a goddess who exists to give Kronos children. And by the time we get to Zeus's generation, there is no direct connection with natural forces at all. The gods of the Olympians, that is, the Olympian gods, control natural forces, like Zeus and the lightning bolt, but they don't personify them as such. And that's a difference. Some scholars see that this increased anthropomorphism of each generation represents the development of civilization. That is, as society progresses, so do the gods become more anthropomorphized. Others point to the very apparent anxiety running throughout Greek culture about the power of women, the fear that women can exert control if they would like. And here we see these elder goddesses trying to exert power, though they can only do so by enlisting the aid of younger males. There are many, many other possible explanations, and again, I think it is a mistake to try to find one and only one meaning in this Uranos, Kronos, Zeus story. Certainly the idea of a struggle between older female deities and younger male deities is one that we will come back to several times during our course. It is worth holding in the back of your mind. And what is interesting to note, and this is, I want to use this as a segue now, a lot of scholars have seen how this sort of intergenerational overthrow by the younger generation of the older one, with the help of the female deities, is very characteristic of other ancient Near Eastern mythology. When we say ancient Near Eastern mythology, we mean cultures like Egypt, Babylon, Sumeria, Assyria. Okay, all of those cultures have their own theogonies, their own various theogonies where individual gods, have their beginning. And when I mention all of this, I want to use this as a segue into kind of a different topic right now, but is of course related to it. And that is, if you pull together some of the things I've said before about how mythology exists only as a category from outside of of a culture, and about how from within the culture it's taken as true, and this idea of the beginning of the world and so on. Invariably, when I've taught this course in person, students will raise their hands and say, well, where does that leave the Bible then? Doesn't that suggest that the Bible is really just, maybe Hebrew mythology or something like that? And I would like to deal with that question head on, because it is obviously an important one. And I want to begin by kind of drawing some larger sort of parallels between the Greek myths that we've been reading about just now, Hesiod, and the ancient Near East. Obviously, Hesiod was very influenced by a lot of these ancient Near Eastern myths, in his raw material that he then shaped, because there are so many similarities here. And let's just begin with some kind of general statements about ancient Near Eastern theogonies as in contrast to the Old Testament. While theogonies differed between people groups in the ancient Near East, each group, each nation was clear that their gods were in fact created, just like Hesiod says. The scholar Walton helps us understand the various accounts of how the gods of the ancient Near East came into being. He says, quote, the following: "The mythology of both Mesopotamia and Egypt makes clear that the gods had origins. They exist in familial relationships, and there are generations of gods. When the texts speak of theogony, the origins of the gods, they include a number of elements in the presentation. In Egyptian literature, it is most common to think of the earliest gods coming into being through bodily fluids, the creator god spitting, sneezing, or sweating, while the later deities are simply born to a previous generation of deity. In the Memphite theology, which is Egyptian theogony, the gods are brought into being by Atum, separating them from himself. One way the creation was expressed was by, quote, the mouth which pronounced the name of everything, end quote. Typically, the first gods created are primordial cosmic gods. Since the forces of nature are expressions and manifestations of the attributes of deities, cosmogony and theogony become intertwined as the natural world comes into being, along with the gods who embody the various elements of the cosmos. And we've talked about this before. Hesiod absolutely fits the same description. In comparison, though, we can see that the Old Testament does not contain a view of theogony at all. Walton goes on to say, the most obvious difference is seen in the absence of any theogony in Israel. The biblical text offers no indication that Israel considered Yahweh as having an origin, and there are no other gods to bring into existence, either by procreation or separation. So this is a stark contrast. This lack of theogony highlights an obvious difference between the Old Testament and other ancient texts, and understanding the gravity of this difference allows us to see the foundation on which each color derived its worldview. The scholar Hayes points out the stark contrast of what this means for the God of the Old Testament in comparison to the gods of the ancient Near Eastern myths. Quote, the absence of theogony and mythology means the absence of a meta-divine or primordial realm from which the biblical God emerges. It also means the absence of the idea that this God is immanent in nature, natural substances, or phenomena. Therefore, the biblical God's powers and knowledge are not limited by the existence of any superior power or substance. Nature is not divine. The created world is not divine. It is not the physical manifestation of various deities. There is no intrinsic material connection between the deity and creation. The line of demarcation is clear. This really is one of the most fundamental differences of worldview between the Old Testament and all of these other Greek and ancient Near Eastern mythologies, that the created, if you were to put a line between God and the creation, there is on one side of that line God, and on the other line, behind the other line, everything else. Okay, the created order is completely of a different character, whereas that is not the case in all of the theogonies that we've been looking at. Now, in order to assess accurately the relationship between the ancient Near East and the Old Testament, we need to understand how these cultures characterize the deities that they worshipped. The characteristics of ancient Near Eastern deities reveal their close commonalities with humanity. And the first example of that is immorality. Okay, the gods of the ancient Near East and of the Greeks are profoundly immoral. As we read about in Oswald, the gods are untrustworthy, seeking their own ends rather than caring for their worshippers' ends. They are constantly fighting amongst each other, often over the most petty matters. They are fearful, especially of death, but they can do nothing lasting about their fears, for each of them, like the stars in their orbits, are fixed to a certain fate. They are limited both in knowledge and in power. And Walton expands upon this point of the human characteristics of the deities by saying, what attributes did Yahweh not have that other deities possessed? This list would include those attributes that assumed a polytheistic system or human foibles, such as craftiness, lust, deception, sexuality, and a host of others. Many more items would be included on this list because the basic qualities came with the fact that the deities of the ancient Near East were perceived in human terms. Another characteristic that is very similar, that where the gods of the Greeks and the ancient Near East are perceived of as being very human-like and having human qualities, is in petulance, okay, irritability. Unlike the God of the Old Testament, the gods of the ancient Near East were very easily offended, and the response to each, the response by each to such offenses, small though they be, often led to an increase in giving and temple remodeling, treaties with neighboring peoples, and so on. Such whims often resulted in rituals designed to placate the gods. One such ritual we read about in the scholar Markham Geller, which existed in Babylon, was called the substitution king ritual, which he summarizes as follows. A substitute king was appointed after an eclipse or unfavorable omen considered to be dangerous to the reigning king, and the ritual provided for the king to step down from his throne for a period of time of up to 6 months in favor of his substitute, who was later executed, thereby fulfilling the ominous prediction. A third characteristic that puts them in kind of in human terms is what we might call natural characteristics, okay? In speaking of the Sumerian gods in particular, Millard shows how natural forces often characterize the gods. Quote, the gods of the Sumerians were the powers of nature as revealed in the world. So the sun god was the sun and the power within it. Just as human activities are limited, so were the gods each restricted to their own sphere. We will see this among the Greeks too. The myths show the gods acting their own positions. They fight to hold their place against evil powers that want to break down the ordered way of life. They quarrel over their areas of influence. They engage in trickery and show every kind of human emotion and vice. On the other hand, in the Old Testament, the Lord is not characterized with inherent human traits or those of nature. He does not contain any traits that would be considered evil or negative. Of course, this results in far fewer characteristics than those of the gods of the ancient Near East, because the Lord's traits are primarily limited to those consistent with a monotheistic worldview: interiority, moral character, and formal relationships. In describing the difference between the Old Testament's God and the gods of the ancient Near East, the scholars Gordon and Rensburg explain that, quote, Yahweh was never a specialized phenomenon of nature such as the sun. Yahweh is represented in the patriarchal narratives as being the supreme God who created heaven and earth, as we read about in Genesis 14:22. As his name indicates, he is the one who calls into being, or the creator. Daniel Block echoes this by saying, on the one hand, insofar as the gods of the nations outside Israel tolerated the worship of other divinities, even by their own people, their absolute status as national deities was diminished. On the other hand, in Israel, Yahweh's position was to be unchallenged. His intolerance of rivals was total, particularly in the minds of Orthodox Yahwists. However, the fact that he welcomed the worship of persons from outside the national group served as an additional limiting factor to his national deity status. While Yahweh had established a special covenant relationship with Israel, his true devotees proclaimed him simultaneously to be the universal God. And of course, this is a major theme throughout the entire Old Testament, that the Lord is the God of the entire universe and not just of one nation. Now, the most foundational difference, the difference that exists at the most foundational level of the ancient Near East versus the Old Testament texts, lays in the worldview of monotheism. There are, of course, throughout the entire Old Testament, we are presented with a clear monotheistic view of God. Okay, and this is to be contrasted in the most starkest terms with the cultures that are around them, from the Greeks to the other tribes of the ancient Near East. Only once, Oswald says very well, in the history of the world has a culture contrived to attain and maintain the idea of the absolute unity of deity. On every side of it, peoples far more brilliant than Israel were maintaining with vehemence the multiplicity of deity. Yet Israel alone insisted on the oneness of God, even in the end, to the death if necessary. Now, there are many Old Testament passages that reference monotheism. The Shema of Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Likewise, Malachi 2:10. Have we not all one Father? Hath not one God created us? Likewise, Isaiah 45:22. Look unto me and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God and there is none else. And there are many others. And thus, it is that the biggest difference of all between Yahweh and other ancient Near Eastern gods is that, as the scholar Cohn put it, Yahweh is no mere chief of the gods. He is the only one God, end quote. Now, this monotheism of the Old Testament was a unique worldview in the ancient Near East. The teachings and literature of the ancient Near Eastern cultures run contrary to the Old Testament teachings on monotheism. And while at times dabbling in monotheistic ideas, these cultures never fully embraced monotheism, and so they reverted to polytheistic philosophies. All of the ancient Near Eastern cultures believed in a multitude of divine beings, and not one of these gods maintained a position of sovereignty or absolute sovereignty over the rest. And I mentioned this before about Zeus, that even though he is envisioned as being kind of the most powerful of all the gods, his sovereignty is never absolute. People work against him, and they circumvent the things that he has laid down. And even he himself, as we will see, is limited by the power of fate, which even he himself cannot change. Paul Copeland highlights the uniqueness of the monotheistic view of God in the Old Testament. Quote, the Israelites introduced a robust monotheism. Rather than being just one God in a pantheon of others, or just a regional deity, Yahweh was and is the only deity who matters. Indeed, he is the only one who exists. Along with this, the Israelites introduced a new way to experience reality. There is a divine being who regularly, personally engages humans, whose choices really make a difference. Now, I realize that some of you, as you're listening to all this, may be thinking, but hey, haven't I heard all sorts of things? Like, don't a lot of scholars nowadays say that there actually are passages in the Bible that seem to promote the idea of polytheism? I know this is oftentimes a point that one hears among Muslim apologists on YouTube and elsewhere, that there are passages in the Old Testament that seem to promote the idea of polytheism. And there are some passages that people point to, such as, for instance, Psalms 136:2, "O give thanks unto the God of gods, for his mercy endureth forever." Or likewise from Judges 16-23, when we read about the rulers of the Philistines who assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." Or likewise in Psalms 82:1, "God standeth in the congregation of the mighty, he judgeth among the gods." Well, these verses and many like them seem to call into question the belief that the people of Israel were purely monotheistic from the start, and that is not an uncommon thing that one sees. If you look up just surface level stuff like Wikipedia level stuff, you will see that sort of thing if you look at different parts of the Old Testament and the entries for them. However, this is actually a very fatuous kind of argument against the monotheistic worldview of the Old Testament, and it is always very important to examine further evidence and to analyze things closer. Polytheistic practices were, in fact, not representative of the Israelite religion of the Old Testament. Rather, the Old Testament called out such practices as foolishness. Indeed, when we read in the Ten Commandments, Exodus 23, "You shall have no other gods before me," what we're really looking at here is the idea that the other gods that are mentioned, the gods of the nations, the gods that are worshipped by the Greeks or the Assyrians or the Egyptians, are in reality not gods at all, but simply demons being called gods. For instance, we read this from the New Testament, but it is perfectly representative of the Old Testament worldview as well. St. Paul says, "Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and for whom all things exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." And if that wasn't clear enough, he goes on a few verses later in 1 Corinthians to explain it even more clearly. "What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons." And therefore, although these objections can have been raised and continue to be raised, there really is no way of getting around it. Deuteronomy, the Shema, the kind of like statement of faith, as it were, in of the Old Testament, really puts it in such stark terms. Deuteronomy 6:4 lays down the very clear claim to the fact that there is only one God. This does not show an inconsistency between the passages that I've quoted before or a contradiction, but instead merely serves as an instance of polemical theology, really, in order that the people of Israel would understand that there is only one God, and to worship any others is nonsense. And to just kind of conclude my remarks on this passage here, we will return to the other, getting back to the myths in a moment, but just to kind of conclude my remarks here, I've only really scratched the surface of a comparative study of the ancient Near Eastern texts in the Old Testament. But even by doing so, we can see that the surface similarities between these texts are really nil compared to the radical worldview differences. These differences don't mean that we won't be able to find any similarities between texts of the Old Testament and ancient mythology. And indeed, we're going to be looking at the flood narrative of Genesis and the flood narrative that is found in Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and ancient Near Eastern texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. But recognizing such similarities, far from actually showing a kind of derivative nature, can help elucidate proper understanding of the Old Testament. The similarities in imagery, in even of different narratives, and of literary style do not invalidate the truth claims of the Old Testament, but instead show a commonality within humanity that is evinced in the literature of even today. As the scholar Heidel puts it, the sacred writers took over figures of speech derived from foreign literature, just as certain of the classical writers of the Christian era patterned some of their finest literary productions after Greek and Roman masterpieces. Since the Old Testament was intended also for the Gentile world, it is but natural that the biblical authors availed themselves of figures of speech and imagery with which also Israel's neighbors were familiar, or which were at least easily understandable to them. So despite the claims by many critical scholars that the Old Testament is merely a retelling of ancient myths plagiarized from other cultures and adjusted to fit the Hebrew worldview, it is far more cogent to assert that the Old Testament is a unique text among ancient Near Eastern accounts. Now, I want to just conclude our discussion today about creation stories within Greek myth by looking kind of at a whole chronological different period. That is from the writings of the Roman author Ovid, who wrote some 700 years after Hesiod. He's writing in Latin, not writing in Greek. And he is writing, as I said, from an entire, from many, many, many centuries later. And so he's going to be retelling us on the surface level. It sounds a little bit similar. It's the same topic. It's the creation of the world, which he begins in his very long poem, The Metamorphoses. But what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that he is basically going to be manipulating his material in a very, very different sort of way. Ovid's overall creation story is very different from Hesiod's, both in tone and in emphasis. Rather than describing the creation of the universe through the creation of the gods, for instance, Ovid simply assumes that there are gods of one type or another, and he uses the standard anthropomorphic gods as characters in his work, the Metamorphoses. But rather than describing the creation of the universe through the creation of the gods, as Hesiod had, Ovid offers alternatives of how the physical universe may have come into being. And he does that by running through all sorts of different possibilities that various philosophers and scientists in the intervening 7 centuries had come up with. And so it's almost like the opening pages of the Metamorphoses are a tour de force by Ovid, in which he shows off just how learned he is, just how erudite he is. He runs through all these various possible scientific theories of his day. Let's just read the opening passages together. I'll give you just to give you a sample of what the Latin sounds like. He wrote in the same dactylic hexameter rhythm as what Hesiod did, but it's in the Latin language. He begins, Antemare terra set quod teget omnia caelum, unus erat toto naturae vultus in orbe, quem dixere chaos rudis indigestaque mollis, nequicam nisi pondus in eris congestaque eodem, non bene iunctarem discordia semina rerum. And the whole poem is like that, these sonorous, beautiful, flowing hexameters. He begins, before the ocean and the earth appeared, before the skies had overspread them all, the face of nature in a vast expanse was naught but chaos, uniformly waste. It was a rude and undeveloped mass that nothing made except a ponderous weight, and all discordant elements confused were there congested in a shapeless heap. As yet the sun afforded earth no light, nor did the moon renew her crescent horns. The earth was not suspended in the air, exactly balanced by her heavy weight. Not far along the margin of the shores had Amphitrite stretched her lengthened arms, for all the land was mixed with sea and air. The land was soft, the sea unfit to sail, the atmosphere opaque, to naught was given a proper form. In everything was strife, and all was mingled in a seething mass. With hot the cold part strove, and wet with dry, and soft with hard, and weight with empty void. But God, or kindly nature, ended strife. He cut the land from skies, the sea from land, the heavens ethereal from material air. And when were all evolved from that dark mass, he bound the fractious parts in tranquil peace. The fiery element of convex heaven leaped from the mass devoid of dragging weight, and chose the summit arch to which the air as next in quality was next in place. The earth more dense attracted grosser parts, and moved by gravity sank underneath. And last of all, the wide surrounding waves in deeper channels rolled around the globe. And when this god, which one is yet unknown, had carved asunder that discordant mass, had thus reduced it to its elements, that every part should equally combine when time began, he rounded out the earth and molded it to form a mighty globe. Then poured he forth the deeps, and gave command that they should billow in the rapid winds, that they should compass every shore of earth. He also added fountains, pools, and lakes, and bound with shelving banks the slanting streams, which partly are absorbed and partly join the boundless ocean. Thus received amid the wide expanse of uncontrolled waves, they beat the shores instead of crooked banks. At his command the boundless plains extend, the valleys are depressed, the woods are clothed in green, the stony mountains rise, and as the heavens are intersected on the right by two broad zones, by two that cut the left, and by a fifth consumed with an ardent heat, with such a number did the careful god mark off the compassed weight, and thus the earth received as many climes, that is, climates. Such heat consumes the middle zone, that none may dwell therein. And two extremes are covered with deep snow, and two are placed betwixt the hot and cold, which mixed together give a temperate clime, and over all the atmosphere suspends with weight proportioned to the fiery sky, exactly as the weight of earth compares with weight of water. And he ordered mist to gather in the air, and spread the clouds. He fixed the thunders that have disturbed our souls, and brought the lightning on destructive winds, that also waft the cold. Nor did the great artificer permit these mighty winds to blow unbounded in the pathless skies, but each discordant brother fixed in space, although his power can scarce restrain their rage to rend the universe. At his command, to far Aurora, Eurus took his sway, to Naboth, Persia, and that mountain range, first gilded by the dawn. And Zephyr's flight was towards the evening star, and peaceful shores, warm with the setting sun. And Boreas invaded Scythia, and the northern snows, and Auster wafted to the distant south, where clouds and rain encompass his abode. And over these he fixed the liquid sky, devoid of weight and free from earthly dross. And scarcely had he separated these, and fixed their certain bounds, and when all the stars, which long were pressed and hidden in the mass, began to gleam out from the plains of heaven, and traverse with the gods' bright ether fields. It's a marvelous piece of poetry, but in those early lines, you can see he's kind of like, maybe it happened with there was a bunch of discordant elements joined together and made the forms that we know. This is the idea of Democritus, who, the 5th century Athenian, who developed the idea of that the entire material world is made up of small little atomoi, or uncuttable particles, indestructible particles flitting around in empty space, which the Roman poet Lucretius, I quoted before, calls the semen aurerum, the exact same words that the seeds of things. This is exactly what the phrase that Ovid uses. So it's a little careful allusion. Then he says, perhaps creation happened when the 4 elements were separated out of chaos, and then came together to make the bodies and the entities that we know. This is the idea of Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher from Sicily, who talks about the 4 different elements and the forces of love and strife, either bringing certain things together, certain opposite forces together, or breaking other ones apart. And he runs through all these different possible scientific theories. He touches on possible theologies. Perhaps there was a creator god. Perhaps nature took it upon herself. All of these different possible things. So what it is, after running through in this very short space a great many possible theories, touching on each, effectively showing how familiar he is with each, but not committing to any one of them, we can see that Ovid is working in a very literate tradition and writing for an extremely literate and erudite audience. He is doing a very different sort of thing than Hesiod is doing, though he's using essentially the same subject matter. And this is a good illustration of the problems built into any discussion of classical mythology. Remember, because classical means both Greek and Latin. In Hesiod, we can feel fairly confident that we are dealing with a recounting of myth that is pretty close to the original oral tradition, which the myth draws upon. But with Ovid, we are dealing with a self-conscious literary reworking of the myths in ways that sometimes go directly against the traditional import of those stories. And so, it's almost like we've gotten to the point where, Ovid is kind of, he's looking at these stories as myth, and he's willing to kind of give maybe a, slightly, it's kind of just a literary rendition of them. He's not looking at them from within the culture so much as maybe stepping out of it and writing about it, recognizing them as myths. And that's interesting. Ovid, in many ways, actually, oftentimes it happens that he is our source for some extremely famous myths that don't exist anymore in Greek, but we derive them from the Greek stories, such as the story of Daphne and Apollo, the famous story of Narcissus, the story of various others that have come down to us only in the texts of Ovid's extremely literary reworking of these myths. Okay, in conclusion, we have begun our discussion of Hesiod's creation story. We have looked at how the world came into existence and the 3-generation struggle for power that ensued after the world came into existence. In our next lecture, we will focus more on what Zeus does after he comes to power and after his consolidation of power and his matings with various other deities and goddesses before he settles down with his permanent wife, Hera. Thank you.